Hello, fellow night owl. Before we begin our journey back in time, I want to say hello to everyone wherever and whenever they are. I'm glad you've chosen to join us for tonight's journey through the eras of our ancestors, wherever you are. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Please leave a comment and let me know. It's always fascinating to see the different places and time zones represented by this wonderful community of history fans and curious people. If you like this kind of calm, immersive storytelling that mixes education and relaxation, please subscribe so you don't miss future adventures through the annals of history. But for now, relax, get comfortable, and let me take you back to a very different time and place. Tonight, we'll learn about what life was like for women in medieval Europe. This was a period between the 5th and 15th century. It was a time of knights and castles, plagues and crusades, tall cathedrals and formal manners. It was a time of big changes and problems, but also of long-standing traditions and social orders. For most women, daily life in the Middle Ages was very different from the romantic ideas we have today about knights, love, and princesses. The reality was often harsh, oppressive, and unforgiving, with women having few rights or freedoms. From birth until death, most women were inferior to men. First, their fathers, then their husbands, with little chance to decide their own lives. Obviously, people's experiences were a bit different depending on their social class and the situation they were in. A rich noblewoman and a poor peasant girl definitely had very different lives. But across the board, women faced many of the same basic challenges and limitations that were based on the main cultural beliefs and practices of the time. In the next few hours, we'll learn about different aspects of medieval womanhood, looking at the typical journey from childhood through adolescence, marriage, and motherhood, all the way to old age. We'll look at what they did every day, what their role was in their family and in society, the health problems and difficulties they had, and the very strict moral rules that governed their behavior. I'll also share the personal stories of several real medieval women whose lives had an impact on history, for better or worse. Everyone was there, from queens and ordinary people to religious sisters and noble women, as well as healers and women accused of being heretics. Each one has a unique perspective that adds to our understanding of this complicated era. But before we go back to the distant past, let's start by explaining what happened. Imagine a world lit only by fire. A world where the sun's movement was the main focus of life. A world of extremes where some people live in extreme luxury and others live in extreme poverty. Imagine a landscape with lots of big stone castles, their towers and battlements looking over the countryside. Nearby, small thatched cottages were grouped around the main house, and smoke was coming from their chimneys. In the distance, you could see the tall towers of a big cathedral, with bells ringing to show the time. The air would have smelt of wood smoke, baking bread, and farm animals. The soundtrack is a noisy mix of barking dogs, braying livestock, and the sounds of hammers and axes being used by blacksmiths and woodcutters. People worked very hard from morning to night, with hardly any time to rest as they tried to survive. A medieval girl was born into this world. From the moment she was born, it was hard for her to survive. This is surprising because we live in a modern world with good healthcare, technology, human rights, and equality. It's really shocking to see how different life was for our foremothers. So, as we look back at the past tonight and try to see things as they did, it's important to remember that we have our own ideas and biases from the 21st century. We can't look at the medieval world using only modern ideas, or judge the people who live there using our own standards and values. We want to understand the lives of these women better. We want to listen to their stories and learn from them. This will help us see how far we've come and how far we still have to go to achieve gender equality. So let's start right at the beginning and look at what life was like for a medieval woman. In the Middle Ages, childhood was a difficult and short stage of life, especially for girls. A lot of children died when they were very young. Most people think that 30 to 50% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. This is much higher than the death rate today. Many young people died from accidents, not having enough to eat, and diseases. This meant that many people thought that their children would not live very long. Even for those who survived as babies, childhood was not the carefree time of play, learning, and discovery that most of us enjoy today. In the past, children were seen as little adults who didn't need any special care. As soon as they could walk and talk, kids were expected to help their family by doing whatever they could. This often involved helping their parents with daily chores and work. Childhood is like a training period for adulthood. It's a time to learn important skills and get ready to take on more grown-up roles and responsibilities. For girls, this meant they spent most of their time doing household chores and had little chance to go to school. Unlike some of their male friends who might go to a church school or get lessons from a religious teacher, most girls were taught at home. From a very young age, girls were taught to fit into their assigned role in society. They were taught to be modest, obedient, and submissive, as well as practical skills like cooking, sewing, spinning wool, and looking after children and the sick. Mothers, grandmothers, and older sisters taught girls by showing them what to do and by being a good role model. This taught the girls the habits and ideas that would shape the rest of their lives. Stories from the Bible and religious teaching also played an important role in a young girl's moral upbringing. These stories made it clear that she should obey her husband. While some noble women might be taught to read and write, this was rare. For most ordinary girls, it was very rare to get any formal education, and very few women could read and write, even among the upper classes. People just didn't think it was as important to educate girls as it was to make sure they were ready to be wives and mothers. The end of childhood was often sudden and clear when people started puberty and got married. In the Middle Ages, marriage was less about love and more about practical reasons like strengthening family ties, getting more money, and having more children. For girls, marriages were usually arranged by their dad or another man in the family, with the bride having little say in the matter. The law said that you could get married when you were 12 if you were a girl and 14 if you were a boy. But actually, people might start planning their wedding when they're much younger. But in reality, most women got married in their late teens to early 20s, especially among the peasant class, where girls were very important for their birth families because they did all the housework. However, it wasn't unusual for very young girls, especially in noble and royal families, to be married to much older men for political or financial reasons. We can only imagine how scared and worried a young girl who has not yet reached puberty would feel if she had to leave her family to live with someone she did not know. One example of a child bride that is worth mentioning is Isabella of Bavaria. She was only 15 when she got married to King Charles VIII of France, who was 16 years older than her. Isabel was a well-known beauty from the minor nobility. She was involved in a political alliance between France and Bavaria, and her personal feelings were not important. The young queen was taken to the French court, which was a strange and glamorous place. She had not expected the difficult jobs she would have to do. Most importantly, she felt pressure to have a son to make sure the royal family would continue. This would be her main focus in the next part of her life as a wife and mother. Looking back at this today, it's hard to imagine how difficult it would have been for these young medieval brides to go from being virgins to being married. They had only ever known one life, and then they were thrown into a new role that was often overwhelming. It is easy to feel isolated and depressed when you are in this situation. Wedding ceremonies were less fancy than we might imagine today, with little of the white lace and decorations that would come to characterize wedding ceremonies in later centuries. For most people, a simple exchange of vows before witnesses, perhaps led by a priest, would be enough to make the marriage official. Only the nobility could afford to have such fancy celebrations. And even then, the focus was more on making connections and celebrating the families joining together than on the individual couple. The bride was basically handed from one man's authority to another's, her own identity being swallowed up into that of her new husband. Sometimes, getting married meant a woman was no longer connected to her family. Poor peasant brides usually stayed close to their parents, but it was normal for a new wife to leave her childhood home and move into her husband's and in-laws' house. There, she would have to get used to a new social order at home. She is learning to get on with her husband's family while also working out her own place in the family. It can be hard for young brides to fit in with their new families, especially if they are still learning to look after a home on their own. But of all the heavy responsibilities that a young wife had, the most important and dangerous was the expectation that she would have children early and often. In the past, not much was known about medicine, and lots of women died having babies. Come with me and join us again next time as we delve into the ups and downs of being a mom in the Middle Ages. We'll talk about the pressure to have kids, the sadness of having only daughters, and the heart-wrenching losses that women from all backgrounds had to face. We'll learn about one of the most interesting mothers of the time, Eleanor of Castile, and look at her complicated life as a queen. Until then, I hope you'll think about the little girls of the Middle Ages. These were girls who wanted to get married and have children, but their childhoods ended almost as soon as they began. Try to imagine what it would be like to have embroidered slippers on your feet and to be facing an uncertain future in a tough world. Sleep well. When we meet again, we will look more into parts of history that are not well known and tell the stories of women who did not have a voice. Their story is important and worth sharing, even if it's hard to understand or access. Thank you for spending time with me. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you again soon for another boring bedtime story that I've found in our shared past. Until then, goodbye. As we have seen, medieval women were treated very badly and had very little freedom. From birth to death, their lives were controlled by the men around them. They are dads, husbands, brothers, and priests. Women had little control over their own bodies, minds, or lives. She was always being watched by men in charge, who were quick to punish any mistake she made. The harsh morality of the Middle Ages, based on religious beliefs, put women in a very difficult position. On the one hand, the church has always taught that women are born sinners and morally weak, and that they are the daughters of the temptress Eve. People thought their beauty was a bad thing, and that it was a way of tricking men. Women were expected to cover their hair and dress modestly to avoid making men feel lustful. At the same time, as wives and mothers, women's main responsibility was to be obedient, pure-minded, and faithful. If a woman seems flirtatious or sexually inappropriate, it could damage her reputation. If a husband committed adultery, it was always seen as his wife's fault. A jealous or angry husband could easily accuse his wife of cheating, and she would be punished. The punishments for women accused of adultery were cruel and humiliating. A woman might be made to walk through the streets with only a piece of fabric around her waist, while a person shouting in the street tells everyone her sins. She could be whipped, dunked in water, or locked in the stocks while crowds jeered and threw rotten food at her. In the worst cases, the punishment was death. However, a woman can be humiliated in public even if she hasn't committed a crime. It was embarrassing to gossip, scold, or nag. It was like a scold's bridle, an iron muzzle that enclosed the head with a metal bit pressing down the tongue. The accused woman would be led through the town, where people would laugh at her and make her feel ashamed. Even for women who wanted to be religious, they still couldn't be free. Nuns lived lives that were all about beauty, with their days planned out by strict prayer schedules and their bodies hidden under loose-fitting habits. It was better to keep quiet. A nun was to be seen, but not heard. Some women even went to extreme lengths. They chose to live as anchoresses, which meant they locked themselves away and lived in a small boat. These religious women were kept in small cells attached to churches. There was only a small window to pass food and receive the sacrament. Most of them would never come back because they chose to live out their lives in this way. One of the most famous anchoresses was the English mystic Julian of Norwich. As a young woman, Julian became very sick and had a series of visions of God. After recovering, she decided to withdraw from the world and live in seclusion. For many years, Julian lived in a very small space, spending her days praying and meditating. She wrote about her mystical experiences in her book, Revelations of Divine Love. People think this is the first book in English that was written by a woman. Julian found spiritual freedom in her confinement. But for most people, it was a really bad sentence. While Julian wrote in her cell, most medieval women worked very hard. Their daily lives were a real nightmare. Domestic violence was seen as something that just went with being married. Men thought it was their job to correct their wives if they went wrong. The story of Margarita Flanders shows that even women from rich families could be in danger. Marguerite was the daughter of King Louis II, and it was expected that she would make a great marriage. Instead, she was kidnapped several times by her husband, the cruel Daves, who kept her locked up for years. Marguerite put up with a lot of mistreatment from him and had many children. When Marguerite finally escaped and ran to her father, her ordeal was far from over. At first, the king supported his daughter, but Davenant successfully argued in court that a wife was basically the property of her husband. Poor Marguerite was forced to go back to the man who was hurting her. He carried on hurting her until he died. The sad story of this French princess was very common. Women were basically seen as the property of men. Women without family or money were easy for men to take advantage of. A woman who lives in the countryside might break her back working on a farm from sunrise to sunset, or hurt herself carrying water and wood for a fire. Her entire body would make babies, always hoping for boys. If she survived childbirth, she then had to deal with the problem of food being scarce. Malnutrition and constant stress would make her look older than she was. She was very sick and her hygiene was poor. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were always there. She was old before her time. For unmarried women, survival often meant resorting to begging or prostitution. In medieval times, unmarried women were seen as suspect. Women were expected to be controlled by a man, either their husband or a male relative. People thought that they were dangerous and unnatural. Those who had to sell their bodies to get by lived on the edge of society. Prostitutes were both necessary and disliked. In cities like London, there were special areas where sex work was allowed, like Sadek. But Wabatai, the woman caught doing her job outside those limits. If they did, they would be fined and whipped. Even though the situation was really bad, prostitutes still had it better than other desperate women. Those who became vagabonds or joined criminal groups were in danger of being treated very badly by the law. In the Middle Ages, justice was quick and cruel. Women could be whipped, marked with a hot iron, or even cut up for crimes as small as stealing something. But all women, whether princess or prostitute, lived in fear of an even darker threat. The very real risk of violence against women was all around them. Men from all classes, from nobles to peasants, saw the women around them as fair game to be used and abused. The idea of consent was basically non-existent, but only if the victim was an unmarried virgin, and preferably from a good family, would people believe her. Even then, the best she could hope for was that her attacker might be pressured into marrying her. He had ruined her, so it was only fair that he should make her his wife. The woman's feelings weren't important. Perhaps the best way to show how scared medieval women were of being accused of witchcraft is to imagine the constant fear they felt. In a world where poor harvests or diseases that killed cattle could threaten a community's survival, women were easy to blame. Any woman who stood out, whether because of what she knew or because she didn't fit in, could find herself criticized. Midwives and female healers were especially targeted because of their skills. A woman who made childbirth easier or helped villages fight diseases was just as likely to be seen as a partner of the devil. If crops failed or babies fell ill, she was blamed for using magic to cause harm. Witch trials were fake, and the outcome was decided from the start. Women accused of witchcraft were stripped and searched for a mark that was said to be the mark of the devil, some small mark on their skin that was said to show they were guilty. People were forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit, and not confessing was also seen as proof of guilt, so innocent people were punished. But some people got lucky and only had to do things like get dunked in water or get publicly humiliated. But many accused witches were killed by burning at the stake in front of a crowd of people who were laughing at them. The clear mistreatment of women in the witch trials showed medieval women that they were in a very dangerous situation. If they made a mistake or did something wrong, it could have very serious consequences. It's amazing that medieval women were able to have any say in their own lives, given the constant threat of male violence. But some amazing people did fight against the life that men and society wanted for them. One of the first professional female authors, Christine de Pizan, dared to challenge the common idea in male scholarly works that women were inferior to men. Her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, collects stories about famous women and directly challenges arguments that hate women. As a widow who wrote to support herself and her children, Depin was treated rudely by male intellectuals. But she continued to argue strongly for women to have the same moral and intellectual values as men. Depin was a feminist long before the movement began. And in the lives of many ordinary women, there were quiet acts of resilience and solidarity. Women supported each other during childbirth and helped look after their children. In the fields, they shared stories and complained, finding moments of joy and laughter in their hard work. Mothers carefully taught their daughters the skills they would need to survive. They taught the next generation how to manage a household and how to deal with marriage, so that they would be able to deal with the hard times they would have. Yes, life was really hard for medieval women. Their world was full of hard work, suffering, and submission. But it's important to remember that women were never just passive victims. They found ways to claim power and agency where they could, both big and small. No matter what happened, they showed great determination, elegance, and strength. As we finish our look at the difficult lives of medieval women, it's worth thinking about how much things have changed. Today, the idea that women should be owned by men and disposed of as they wish is completely unacceptable. And while some cultures still accuse people of witchcraft, we no longer burn women at the stake for crimes they did not commit. But even though things are improving for women, we must remember that there are still a lot of injustices and oppressions that women face around the world. The forms may have changed, but the fight for true fairness and freedom is far from over. Medieval misogyny may seem like it's from a long time ago, but its effect can still be seen today. So, as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate the strength and courage of the women who came before us. They faced challenges that seemed impossible, and by doing so, they created opportunities for future generations to build a better future. We should remember the medieval women who suffered, and we should keep trying to create a better world for women. The road ahead may be long, but as Christine de Pizan wrote so well, women have been powerless for so long that some men think it is just the way things are. We are proving those men wrong, brick by brick, and building a new reality. Medieval women may have lived in a time of darkness, but they had strong spirits, and they showed us the way forward like candles in the night. And that, my friends, is boring history worth remembering at bedtime. Sweet dreams. The poor hygiene and sanitation of medieval times made life unpleasant for everyone. But women had extra challenges in managing their periods. In the past, most women used things like cloth pads or rags that they washed and reused. These offered little protection against leaks. Some women used grass, hay, sheep's wool, or even moss to stuff into their undergarments during their periods. As you might expect, chafing and infections were common problems. Bathing was a rare luxury for medieval women from lower classes. Even if they had access to a river or stream for washing, the water was often dirty with human and animal waste, which spread diseases. Most people thought that water could make you sick by getting into your body through your skin. This meant they bathed less often, maybe a few times a year, and sometimes used sponges to wash. Lice and fleas were everywhere. Washing clothes was another problem. Clothes had to be washed by hand. This meant using a pot over a fire or a river. Then they were scrubbed against a washboard. After that, they were wrung out and hung to dry. The process took a long time and was very tiring. If you put wet, heavy clothes near a fire, they could catch fire. Most families had only 1 or 2 sets of clothes that were worn very often, which made it even harder to launder. In the castles and manor houses of the nobility, the floors were cleaner, but not as clean as they are today. The rich could pay for servants to heat water, prepare baths, and wash clothes more often. Scented oils and herbs can help to stop bad smells. But even the grandest stone fortress lacked running water, flush toilets, and proper waste disposal. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows into the courtyards. It's interesting that one of the most popular and valuable wedding gifts for a medieval bride from an aristocratic family was a flea fur. A fur wrap is used to stop fleas from biting the dog. There were pests everywhere. Rats ran through the bedrooms and dining halls, spreading fleas that carried the bubonic plague. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, it killed around 60% of the population. Women were the ones who looked after the sick and the dead. The plague killed many people and caused a lot of damage in the years it spread. This made big changes to medical care in medieval times. Looking after the sick was mostly the job of women in their roles as wives, mothers, midwives, and nuns. In the past, when there were not many doctors and they cost a lot of money, the care that women provided was very important. Hospitals were often found in convents, and they were there to help people who were very poor and had nowhere to go. Elderly nuns passed down herbal remedies to their novices. Some women used their knowledge of healing to become midwives, pharmacists, and surgeons. In 14th century Paris, Jacqueline Felicia de Almenia was put on trial by the medical faculty of the University of Paris for illegally practicing medicine as a woman. Her patients, including priests and noble women, spoke highly of her. They praised her skills in diagnosing and treating patients, saying that she was better than male doctors. However, she was excommunicated and banned from practicing. It was unusual for a woman to do well in a male-dominated field like medicine. Women's home remedies were often thought of as witchcraft and superstition. Anyone who did not follow the church's rules could be accused of being a heretic or a witch. Midwives were especially likely to be accused of sorcery. If a baby or mother died while giving birth, or if a woman knew about plants and herbs that could ease pain or end a pregnancy, she could be accused of working with the devil. In some villages, the wise woman might be respected as a healer when she is young, but hated as a witch when she is old. Inquisitors questioned and tortured suspects to make them confess. Once a woman was accused, it was very difficult to prove she was innocent, especially if she was unmarried or elderly with no male relatives to defend her. Women made up over 80% of the estimated 50,000 to 100,000 people executed for witchcraft between 1500 and 1660. In the Middle Ages, when men had a lot of power, they used witch hunts and burnings to punish women who they thought were breaking the rules. Even a woman who tried to be the perfect wife, mother, and Christian was still seen as being as bad as Eve because of the original sin, and thought of as having little willpower and being easily tempted. Women were taught to be submissive and to serve their husbands and children. Going out made men want to be with her and ruined her reputation. An unmarried woman was seen as a liability, as she was unable to fulfill her main purpose of having children. A married woman was her husband's property. He could protect or punish her as he saw fit, regardless of her feelings on matter. In the past, women's value was often linked to whether or not they could have children, which put a lot of pressure on them to have kids. Pregnancy was a time of hope and fear. In the past, noble women were considered successful if they had at least one son who survived until he was old enough to be a man. If a queen didn't give birth to a prince, she might be replaced by someone who could. This makes me think of what happened to Henry VIII's wives. Women from poor families had more reason to worry about getting pregnant and having a baby without access to the best food, living conditions, and medical care. Not eating enough food caused many women to have rickets, which is a vitamin D deficiency that can make their pelvises deformed. This makes childbirth even more difficult and dangerous. It used to take days, even weeks, for a baby to be born. It was a very painful process. If the birth seemed to take a long time, a midwife might suggest using the girdle of the Virgin Mary that's kept in the local church treasury. This was believed to help the baby come out more quickly. This relic was not very useful. Midwives tried to ease the baby's suffering with herbal remedies, but they could only hope to catch the baby and save the mother from FARDA. Izab's situation was not the only one like it. For girls born into noble families, their wedding day was often planned for before they turned 18. The needs of the family and political agreements were more important than a young bride's personal feelings or wishes. Even though Isabel was a queen, she still had to deal with a lot of the same problems as other women when it came to getting married and having children in medieval times. The pressure to have a son was very strong. In the past, a woman's value was often based on how many children she could have and whether those children survived. If they didn't deliver a boy, people thought they were shameful. Even for queens, childbirth was a very scary experience with a lot of danger, especially because medical knowledge was very basic. With each pregnancy, a woman was putting her life in danger. Queen Eleanora of Castile, who was married to Edward I of England, had 16 babies over 28 years in the late 13th century. Amazingly, she survived them all, but sadly many of the children did not. Her trials showed how strong and resilient medieval women were when faced with unimaginable adversity. Most people, not queens, had to do a lot of difficult work every day from sunrise to sunset. If a woman wasn't busy with household chores, she was likely working alongside her husband in the fields, fetching water, or gathering firewood. Privacy was a luxury that most families didn't have in the Middle Ages. Most homes were small and cramped. People lived very close together in these homes. They ate, slept, and lived their lives in very close quarters. People had to share beds because there weren't enough beds, and this could cause arguments between couples or parents and children. The cleanliness and sanitation were not up to modern standards. Fleas, lice, and other pests were just something you had to deal with. Chamber pots were kept close by, and rubbish was often thrown into the streets. It's easy to see why diseases spread quickly in medieval towns and cities. But perhaps no aspect of a woman's life was as difficult and sad as the fact that she couldn't control her own life. The idea of being free and making your own decisions, which most of us take for granted today, did not exist for most women in the Middle Ages. From when she was born to when she died, a woman's life was controlled by the men in it. They are fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons. Even a woman who was very talented and smart had a hard time making a living on her own. The French writer Christine Dupin is a rare exception. After losing her husband at a young age, Dupin did not follow the norm by supporting herself and her children as a professional writer and author. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she imagined an imaginary city full of great women from history and mythology. It was a revolutionary act of the imagination in a time when most people thought that women were weak and easily influenced and incapable of being sensible or good. But Dupin's ideas about feminism were very advanced for the time. For most medieval women, their bodies were not fully their own. They had to do whatever their husbands wanted, and they could be physically and sexually abused by them. They had no way to stop it. In the past, a woman was seen as her husband's property, so marital rape was not a concept that was understood. Domestic violence was seen as the husband's role. If a wife who had been hit complained, she was more likely to be punished for making him angry than to see justice served. Even though he was born into a high-class family, he was still at risk of being abused by his wife. In the 14th century, when Marguerite, the Countess of Flanders, displeased her cruel husband, Louis of Maille, he had her abducted, imprisoned, and threatened with execution. Her story sounds like something out of a Gothic novel, but for many medieval women, this was their reality. The church was a big part of medieval society, and it often made people think badly of women. Ever since the story of Eve and the apple, women have been seen as bad and as people who make men do wrong things. Women's sexuality was seen as something that should be repressed and strictly controlled. The most important thing for a woman was to remain pure. The best was for her to be a virgin and dedicated to God. But if not, then she should be a good wife and mother. Any woman who broke the rules and behaved differently was in trouble. The consequences could be very serious. A ruined reputation, being left alone, being hit, and in the worst cases, even death. Some religious women tried to escape the dangers and disappointments of the outside world by withdrawing into a life of religious seclusion. The English mystic Julian of Norwich chose to live in a small cell attached to a church in the early 15th century, receiving food and other necessities through a small window. There, she spent many years in isolation, praying and thinking deeply, and even wrote a series of remarkable revelations. For her, the anchoresses' cell meant safety and spiritual purpose. But to most people today, it looks a lot like solitary confinement. As we have seen, life for medieval women was defined by constraints on the opportunities available to them, on their bodies and on their spirits. These constraints were imposed by rigid gender roles and religious doctrine, and women were confined to the home. She faced a lot of challenges and often died young. But then, as now, women found ways to stand up for themselves and fight against the oppression they faced. They kept going through hard times and good times, being angry and being hopeful, crying and working hard. The centuries have brought us a lot of freedom and progress, but the idea that women are inferior to men is still very common today. Even now, we are still dealing with many of the same issues: unequal treatment, the policing of women's bodies, gender-based violence, and discrimination. When we learn about the struggles that our foremothers went through, we realize how strong they were and how far we still have to go. As we remember the women of the past, we honor their sacrifices and their strong spirit when things were difficult. We should always try to create a better world where a woman's value is based on her intelligence, kindness, strong beliefs, and great character. It is hard for us to imagine what it was like to live in a medieval peasant's house because we are used to modern comforts. Picture a small house with just 1 or 2 rooms. The walls are made from wooden poles put together with sticks and filled with a basic mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The floor was just hard-packed dirt that had been walked on by many generations. If the family had a bit more money, they might like to have a few rough wooden planks put across the dirt floor. But it would be hard to stay warm because of the damp and the cold that came up from the ground, making it feel as cold as the bone. The thatched roof might keep out the worst of the rain, but it was a constant battle to repair the leaks and keep the vermin out. In one corner of the sad room, a medieval woman was sitting by the fire. Her face was stained by soot, and her homespun woolen dress was dirty. Her rough, chapped hands were used to stir a watery soup, the main food of a poor family. Whatever vegetables could be found went into the bubbling liquid, along with a bit of salted pork if they were lucky. This was the world of the medieval housewife. It was a dark and cramped world, surrounded by the bare walls of the cottage and the muddy tracks of the village outside. From sunrise to sunset, her life was all about working nonstop. She feeds the fire, carries water, cooks, spins, sews, washes, scrubs, and looks after her husband and children. The saying, "a woman's work is never done," is true. This was especially true in the Middle Ages. While her husband worked in the fields, or perhaps had a job as a blacksmith or carpenter in the village, a woman's place was firmly in the home. Her role was to look after others and not think about what she wanted for herself. The tools she used were simple, and there weren't many of them. A couple of cast iron pots, some wooden bowls and utensils, a stone quern for grinding grain into flour, a spindle and spindle winder for spinning wool into thread. With just a few simple tools, she was expected to work magic in the home, making the most of whatever she had to feed and clothe her family. But even as she stirred the pottage, a type of stew, and kneaded the dense black bread that was the staple of the medieval peasant diet, a woman's mind might also think about more important things. The priest's Sunday sermon had talked about the Virgin Mary, a perfect example of a woman. She gave birth to Jesus. Women should have a better life than this. But she quickly stopped herself. But for a medieval woman, being good and going to heaven was not about having big dreams. It was about being nice to her husband and to God. If they wanted more, people might say they were proud or stubborn, or even that they were a witch. No, it's better to keep your head down, stay good, and hope for the best in the future. In the mortal realm, a woman's life was full of constant hardship and servitude. And woe betide any woman who dared to step out of line or question her position, as we shall see in the stories to come. One woman who dared to dream of a different kind of life was Christine de Sand. She was born in Venice in 1364. Christine's father was a famous doctor and astrologer, someone who studies the stars, who got a job at the King of France's court when Christine was very young. Christine grew up in a very smart and exclusive environment at the royal court, where she received the best education that a medieval girl could get. She learned to read and write in Latin and French, studied classic books and philosophy, and even had access to the king's amazing library, which had a huge amount of knowledge that most people of her time didn't have. Her father was ahead of his time in thinking about education for girls. He wanted her to be smart and encouraged her to study. When she was 15, Christine was married to a nobleman called Etienne Castel. It was an arranged marriage, which was typical at the time, but the couple loved and respected each other deeply. Christine had 3 children and settled into the role of a beautiful wife and mother. But Christine's quiet home life was not to last. In just a few short years, she lost her beloved husband to an outbreak of plague, followed by her father's death not long after. When she was 25, Christine lost her husband and children. She was left alone to look after her young children in a world that did not value an educated woman without a man to protect her. Christine was in a lot of money trouble, and she was worried that she would lose her favorite books. So she made a brave decision that no one had ever made before. She would support her family by writing, becoming one of Europe's first professional female authors. Christine was one of the few women who wrote medieval literature, which was mostly written by men. She started out writing love ballads and religious poetry, which were seen as safe and harmless. But as her confidence and reputation grew, Christine started thinking about more serious things. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she passionately defended women against the misogynistic, woman-hating attitudes of her time. With clever and direct arguments, Christine showed that women were just as moral and intelligent as men. She said that women were just as good at being virtuous, learning, and leading as men were, but that they just needed a chance to show this. In a series of lively biographies, Christine celebrated the achievements of great female scholars, artists, warriors, and saints from history. From the ancient world to her own time, she spoke about women who had overcome great difficulties to achieve great things. One example is Hypatia of Alexandria, a famous scholar who was murdered by a mob for teaching philosophy and mathematics. The fearsome Queen Semiramis of Assyria was a brilliant military strategist who conquered large parts of the ancient world. And the good and religious Hildegard of Bingen, whose amazing visions and beautiful music made her famous throughout Christianity. In each story, Christine challenged misogyny, the belief that women are inferior to men, and argued for the basic equality of men and women. Her strong message was liked by a small but growing group of well-educated women who saw Christine as a symbol of hope in a society that wanted to keep them in the shadows. Christine's early feminist ideas did not go down well with the men in charge. Some people criticized her strongly and even laughed at her. People say she's a shrill harpy or a delusional madwoman. Her own lifelong struggle for recognition and respect showed how hard it was for medieval women who wanted more than to be a wife and mother. But Christine refused to be silenced. She wrote a lot until she died around 1430. She wrote so much that her books influenced generations of women after her. Her legacy is a great example of how one woman's voice, raised in defiance of oppression, could echo down through the centuries. As we carry on learning about the lives of medieval women, Christine Desar is a rare example of a good thing in a bad situation. For most of her peers, the idea of an independent intellectual life was nothing more than a distant dream. Marguerite's story shows how hard it was for noble and high-born women in medieval society. She was a very rich and important woman, but she was still controlled by the men in her life and could be traded and treated like a piece of property. The fact that her husband got away with it shows that gendered abuse and oppression were often tolerated or overlooked. A woman's well-being was simply not a priority. Women from poorer backgrounds had it even worse. Women from poor families were easy targets for exploitation by lords, masters, and even their own husbands or fathers because they had little money or status to protect them. Domestic abuse was common. People did not see it as a crime, but as a way for men to control their wives and daughters. According to the church's teachings, a woman's role was to obey and submit. If she stepped out of line, violence was considered an acceptable form of discipline. Women had very little legal protection. In most parts of medieval Europe, women couldn't take legal action against an abuser, ask for a divorce, or get justice for themselves. People rarely got involved in their neighbors' lives because they thought personal problems were private. But if an abuser was really bad and well-known, people might talk. Women were expected to stay silent. If a woman left her husband, her reputation would be ruined. A noble woman would only ask her family or the church for help in the most extreme cases of cruelty. But not all requests were followed. After all, a wife was her husband's property, his to treat as he pleased at home. It was not unusual for a wife who had been hit to be sent back to her husband after a short break. If her family didn't have enough money to send her to a convent, her options were limited. One of the most famous abduction cases of the Middle Ages is a good example of this. It was about a woman called Marguerite of Flanders. Marguerite was born in 1350. She was the only daughter of Louis II, Count of Flanders. As the only person who could inherit one of the richest areas of Europe, she was a very desirable bride. She was only 11 when she married Philip of Rouver, Duke of Burgundy. But he died just 4 years later, leaving teenage Marguerite a very rich widow who needed a new husband. Her father quickly arranged another political marriage for her. This time it was Philip the Bold, who was also from Burgundy. But there was another person who wanted to buy the house too. Marguerite's own cousin, Louis III, Count of Flanders. Louis wanted to keep control of Flanders within the family. He then brazenly abducted his young cousin and took her to Ghent. The poor girl couldn't really say what she wanted, as the men in her life were fighting over her money. Although her father eventually found her and understood that she had been tricked into marrying Philip, the whole story shows that even rich women were just pieces in the games men played. Such casual misogyny and oppression were a normal part of a medieval woman's life, including spiritual matters. At that time, the Catholic Church taught that women should be subservient, sinful, and sexually tempted. Ever since Eve ate the forbidden fruit, people have thought of women as being morally weaker and more likely to do wrong things than men. Women were thought to be born more lustful, vain, emotionally unsteady, and less intelligent than men. These supposed flaws justified their subordination to cool, rational men. These men were tasked with controlling women's behavior for their own good and that of society. The church taught that good women were obedient, pure, modest, quiet, and always helpful to their parents, brothers, and husbands. Any woman who didn't fit this perfect image was quickly judged. Women who were outspoken, defiant, ambitious, or opinionated were seen as a threat to the social order. And of course, people who had sex outside of marriage or did other things that were considered to be sinful were seen as tempting men to do wrong things. It's important to remember that it was usually men who forced and exploited women into these situations. It's no surprise that one of the worst labels a woman could get was that of a witch. In the medieval church, witchcraft was seen as the worst kind of evil that women could do. A woman is under the control of the devil. She uses magic to challenge the power of men and to harm innocent people. What kind of woman would make such horrible accusations? She was often a social outcast. She might be a widow living alone, an unmarried older woman, a midwife or herbalist, a beggar, or someone who didn't fit into the role of wife and mother. Such vulnerable women were the perfect scapegoats for any kind of misfortune that might happen to a community. This could be anything from failed crops to sickness to impotence. And even the slightest bit of evidence could be used to justify horrific torture and execution methods. From being burned at the stake to being hanged to being drowned. The terrible witch hunts of the early modern period started because the medieval church did not trust women and thought they had demonic powers. Most women were not at all powerful. The opposite is true. No matter if she was a highborn lady or a lowly peasant, a woman's life was very restricted. Men had complete control over her, limiting what she could do. So they prayed. Religion was one of the only areas where women had some independence and could express themselves, but only in a limited way and always within strict rules. Becoming a nun was a way for some women to live a life of learning without having to deal with men. Female mystics were also tolerated and even respected so long as they limited their spiritual visions to religious subjects. One such mystic was Julian of Norwich. an English anchoress who lived a radical form of the monastic life. In her 30s, she asked to be locked up in a small cell attached to a church. There, she would spend the rest of her days praying and thinking. The door to herself was closed forever in a serious ceremony. People thought that she would never pass through it again, even in death. Her body would later be taken out through the high window that looked out onto the church interior. For many years, Julian lived in a stone room that was no more than 15 paces long. He received food and other necessities through a small opening in the wall. But some women still preferred this life of loneliness and poverty to getting married. As an anchoress, Julian was only responsible to Christ, not to anyone else. She could focus completely on her spiritual practice without worrying about household chores or having children. Through the window, she also helped people by praying for them and giving them advice. In this role, she gained a lot of influence and authority, which is not often given to women. She wrote about her spiritual experiences in her book, Revelations of Divine Love, where she even described God as a caring mother. It was very brave of her to offer her own religious interpretations. The fact that her writings survive it all shows how much respect she had in her community. But Julian's life was still difficult in the end. Like all medieval women, she lived under the control of a male-dominated church and society that saw women as a threat and wanted to contain them. Whether they were trapped in a loveless marriage, locked away in a cold castle, or trapped in a monastery, women had little control over their own lives. Their world was full of difficult decisions and missed opportunities, where their talents and dreams were not allowed to come true. The rules were simple: submit, stay silent, and survive. Medieval women may not have thought about their situation in terms of equality or justice, but they surely felt the constraints on their minds and bodies as a kind of slow suffocation, a narrowing of possibilities. But they kept going. They found a little bit of light in the darkness. They were proud of their children, their work, and their religion. They tried their best to support their communities and families. This meant that medieval women paved the way for future progress. They showed great courage and determination, and this led to more people being free in the future. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us honor these people and let us dream of the lives they might have lived in a world that cherished them fully. And let us continue their stories, remembering how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Because in the end, women's history is human history. We are all connected, and our freedom is linked to each other's. And with that, I say good night. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of better times. Marguerite's story is a sad example of the difficult situation of noble women in medieval society. People's choices and consent didn't matter much. A woman, especially a wife, was seen as something to be owned and used. Unfortunately, this lack of respect for women's bodily autonomy was common in all parts of society. Domestic violence was common, and husbands had the right to physically punish their wives as they wanted to. The 15th century Liber Extra says that a husband can hit his wife as part of her punishment. She belongs to him, so he can punish her. Women who worked on farms often had to deal with their husband's frustrations. These frustrations were caused by the difficult and long working days, the poor food rations, and the poor living conditions. Large families were living in very small cottages, so there was no privacy and people got angry easily. The wine and ale they drank to stop them from starving, and the dirty water they drank did not help things. If a husband was from an aristocratic background, he might be a bit more careful about hitting his wife because he didn't want people to think badly of his wife. But spousal abuse was still common, just less obvious. A noble woman was still his property, and he could discipline her as he pleased. Her job was to do whatever he said. The biggest violation was marital rape. which just wasn't on people's radar in medieval times. In the past, marriage was mostly about men having kids, so a husband could have sex with his wife whenever he wanted. It was decided that her willingness to take part was not important. These attitudes were made worse by religious beliefs and the fact that medicine at the time was very basic. The church taught that women were born sinners, full of lust, and needed to be controlled by men. Women's desire was seen as strange, but men's desire was seen as normal and unavoidable. If a husband forced himself on his wife, maybe her behavior had triggered his basic instincts. At the same time, medical books said that for a woman to be able to have a baby, the man had to make her feel warm and excited. It was thought that women enjoying themselves was an important part of getting pregnant. So, if a wife got pregnant, she must have been happy to have sex, even if she didn't want to. At the same time, people often blamed the victim and misunderstood biological factors. This meant that women who had experienced sexual violence had limited options for recourse. When she spoke up, people were unkind to her, doubted her, and said she was trying to seduce him. She wanted it. She tempted him to do something wrong. The medieval poem called The Ruppling even said, if you can't stop something, you might as well enjoy it. So, if a woman was attacked, her best option was to avoid getting pregnant and feeling ashamed. Midwives and healers shared secret recipes for herbal abortifacients and contraceptives. Some plants like pennyroyal, tansy, and certain types of fungi can cause miscarriage. Others, like rue and Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot seeds, can help prevent conception. Women shared this secret information with each other. But even these small rebellions against men's control over women's bodies put women at risk of bleeding, infection, and even accusations of witchcraft. People in the Middle Ages just couldn't imagine women having control over their own reproduction. Anything that stopped a husband from doing what he wanted or a pregnancy from happening was surely the work of the devil. Some women internalized this oppression, meaning they believe they deserve the abuse they suffer. When marriage was the only option for women, and their husbands had all the power, what else could they do but submit? How could she imagine it being any other way? But despite the pain and suffering, medieval women kept going. They helped each other with their wounds, said kind words to each other, and in quiet moments created lives that were better than their suffering. They kept going as wives, mothers, and in general, even though the world didn't give them much. This old idea of women being strong was continued by an English mystic who became one of the most important Christian theologians of her time. But she didn't choose to live in a cloister. She did it to escape an unwanted marriage. Julian of Norwich was born in 1343. She was probably the daughter of a noble family that had fallen on hard times. She didn't have any powerful friends or family members to help her. This meant that she didn't have many options. A woman who is not married and has to rely on her relatives or a life of very hard work on the farm. For women who were not treated well outside of the convent, it offered protection and a way to appear respectable. So, when she was about 30, Julian decided to become an anchoress, which is a very extreme form of religious life. She was locked up in a small room attached to a church, and she spent her days in prayer and thinking, never coming out into the light of day. The ceremony was as serious as a funeral. An anchor left the world of the living for good. The bishop would sprinkle the tomb of her cell with dust and say, "Intone ashes to ashes, dust to dust." With the cell door broken, she was considered dead to everyone she knew. When Julian entered her tomb while she was still alive, she probably felt a mixture of fear and relief. Luckily, she had not had to deal with the usual problems that many women face when they get married and have children. But she was trapped in a stone prison that was barely big enough to lie down in. But even though he was a religious man, Julian must have thought that this difficult life was still better than being a farm animal. An anchoress was a medieval woman who was almost completely independent. She survived by eating the food that her followers gave her. She was not dependent on a husband or father. She was free to spend her days on her own, thinking about her husband in heaven. What's more, in a society that thought women's words were worthless, most people didn't take announcements very seriously. People from the town would go to the small curtain in Julian's cell to talk about their problems and hopes, and try to receive divine wisdom from the holy woman's lips. Julian did, though, and was surprisingly modern for the time. In 1373, she had a series of vivid visions while she was very sick. These mystical showings completely changed traditional Christian beliefs about sin, being punished in hell, and a wrathful God. Most importantly, her ideas were all about Jesus' Mother Mary and the idea that God is like a mother. Julian saw God as a kind and caring parent who loved all of creation and would never send any of their children to eternal hellfire. God is our mother as truly as he is our father. She said, "We grow and develop through our mother, Jesus. In mercy, he reforms and restores us." This gentle way of thinking about motherhood was very different from the harsh idea that women were evil and full of sin. For Julian, it was men's pride and buying love that ruined God's perfect creation. Women like Mother Mary showed the purest form of Christ-like love and mercy. When Julian wrote about her ideas about love, she became the first woman to write a book in the English language. Despite her physical limitations, her extreme compassion had a powerful effect on the popular religious imagination. Decades after her burial, local people still referred to her as Dame Julian, who lived at Norwich. Julian's body was still protected by her anchor hold, but her mind and spirit were free. In her cell, she created a beautiful and meaningful interior world that was a contrast to the brutality of the outside world. For her and many other female mystics who lived alone, the convent was a place of safety and a chance to think deeply about spiritual matters. Even so, Julian's unlikely victory cannot cancel out the sadness of medieval women's lives. The fact that a lifetime of lonely isolation was sometimes the best option shows just how hard life was for them. Most of them never got out of the prisons of their own country, which were their whole life. Yet lying here in the dark, listening to their softly unspooling stories, perhaps we can be as kind as Julian was to the mother heart of God. We can honor how they suffered, how they kept going, and how they found strength to live even though it was so hard. We want to create a world where no woman has to decide between a physical or mental prison to know her own worth. But the church did offer one surprising path for some women who wanted to live a life devoted to faith. For some women, joining a convent was a way to live without getting married or having children, and a way to use their brains. One of the most interesting people to follow this path was Hildegard of Bingen, who was born in 1098 to a noble family in the Rhineland. Hildegard was the 10th child in her family. Because of this, she was sent to live in a monastery at the age of 8. This strict life did not make her unhappy, however. From a young age, she had spiritual experiences that she wrote about in detail. Her musical compositions were very new and different, from lively church songs to the first known play about morality that was set to music. As an adult, Hildegard went on to found her own abbey and become famous as a prophet and intellectual across Europe. She exchanged letters with popes, emperors, and kings who asked her for spiritual advice. She knew a lot about religion, science, medicine, and philosophy. She used to treat sick nuns and local villages with plants. Hildegard was very clever, and her story shows how important learning and culture were for women in monasteries. Nuns were not allowed to get married, but they were allowed to study. They spent their days praying, meditating, tending gardens, and creating amazing art and literature. Copying manuscripts and illuminating sacred texts were common tasks. With this freedom to read, write, and create, their minds could wander and grow. But being a monk was not without sacrifices. Nuns promised to be poor, chaste, and obedient, giving up worldly pleasures and attachments. Their lives were governed by strict routines of prayer and work, and they were still ultimately under the authority of male religious leaders. But for women who really felt drawn to religion, the convent was a place to escape the problems of the outside world. Another famous religious woman of the time was Catherine of Siena. She was born in 1347 to a large working-class family in Italy. From a young age, Catherine was very religious and refused to marry for money. She made a vow to become a member of the order when she was 18. This meant she would commit to a life of prayer, fasting, and helping the sick and poor. Like Hildegard, Catherine had mystical visions of Christ and was considered a saint. She was also unafraid to speak truth to power. In her letters, she strongly criticized religious leaders for corruption and called for changes to be made in the church. When the Pope left Rome because of political problems, Catherine went to France and convinced him to go back to the Holy City. When Christianity was split into two different groups, one with the Pope and one without, Catherine worked really hard to bring the two groups back together again. Her spiritual memoir, The Dialogue, was very important because it included conversations with God. This was at a time when the church was seen as the only way to talk to God. Catherine was exhausted from her efforts and extreme beauty routine. She died at the age of 33. Her body was worn out, but her soul was at peace. Women like Hildegard and Catherine showed that women could be great thinkers and spiritual leaders, even though they were living in a society that did not value them. They used their faith to live lives that were different from the norm. Most medieval women could never have imagined having such influence, but the presence of these monks and religious scholars added a new layer of complexity to the gender dynamics of the era. But for most people, the church was more of a way to make them behave well than a way to make them better people. Church leaders tried to make sure people behaved in a way that was acceptable to the church. They were especially strict about sex and what people should do to be good members of society. Women's behavior was strictly controlled. They were to be obedient, pure, and perfect. If you go beyond these limits, the consequences could be severe. In the 13th century, the medieval Inquisition started to take action against people who were thought to be spreading ideas that went against church beliefs. Inquisitors targeted many groups, but women were especially at risk of being accused of witchcraft and working with the devil. The term witchcraft was often vague and all-encompassing. Anything from strange noises to mysterious potions could be a sign that something is wrong. As fear and superstition spread, midwives and female healers were targeted. People thought that their knowledge of childbirth and herbal remedies was dark magic. One of the most well-known books used to identify witches was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, which was published in 1487. This shocking text said that women are more likely to be tempted by the devil because they are more easily influenced by their desires. It included instructions for how to question accused witches, and this was usually enough to make them confess, even if they were being tortured. If people were found guilty of a crime, they would be punished in a very cruel way. They could be beheaded, hanged, or burned at the stake. These punishments were public and meant to scare other people into being good and following the rules. The worst of these witch hunts happened in the 16th and 17th centuries, but they started with the medieval church, who did not trust women. People could also use the idea of witchcraft in a more dishonest way. Women who rejected a man or spoke up too much could be punished. Women who were widowed or single and lived on the edge of society were often blamed for problems. The crime was vague, which made it easy to use as an excuse to get rid of women who were a nuisance. Every day, the religious life of the people was centered on regular church services, feast days, and seasonal celebrations. Women were expected to be the family's religious leaders, spending time on their prayers and religious activities. Church festivals were a big part of the year: Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, and Saints' Days. Women spent a lot of their free time getting ready for these events. At the same time, some older pagan traditions continued and mixed with Christian practices. Medieval holidays often included wild, earthy activities like maple dances and harvest revelry, which the church tried to control. Some women found a way to enjoy and feel happy during these religious festivals. In the Middle Ages, the church was a very powerful institution that women had to be very careful around. It offered a justification for their subjugation based on their beliefs and an escape route from worldly demands. Women had to be very careful because people thought they should be perfect, but also thought they were lying all the time. Another thing that stopped them from being free was that they had to follow the rules of their religion. As we have seen, medieval women faced challenges in all areas of life, including their homes, jobs, and churches. But even in this tough environment, some people found ways to make their lives have meaning and to take control, however small. As we come to the end of our journey through this era that feels far away, but is still important to us, we'll meet a few more extraordinary women who did important things and think about how the medieval way of thinking still affects gender relations today. The road behind us is long and winding, but there are still surprises ahead. Medieval women had very long and difficult days. They had to do lots of different jobs and take on many responsibilities. A woman always had to be busy from sunrise to sunset. While their husbands and fathers worked in the fields or went to war, it was the women's job to keep the home fires burning and burning. They kept them going, getting up before sunrise each day to stoke the fires, cook the meals, look after the children, and care for the sick and elderly. Women had little rest and even less recognition for the vital role they played in keeping their families and communities functioning. Their daily work was seen as just part of their usual duties as women, as normal and expected as the sun rising and setting. A woman's value was judged by the son she gave birth to, how tidy her home was, and how well she followed the rules of men in charge of her. The few women who dared to step outside of these restrictive roles were met with disapproval, suspicion, and even danger. In medieval times, being an independent woman or an educated one was seen as something that went against nature. Women had their place, and any woman who acted differently was punished. But even in the very strict social order that controlled every part of a woman's life, some women found ways to make their own choices and be in charge of their own lives. With a lot of determination, they managed to find a way to get out. They broke the rules that were meant to hold them back, took advantage of the ways the patriarchy could be exploited, and when all else failed, they secretly tried to destroy the system that tried to hold them back. These were the women who became healers and midwives, nuns and anchoresses, artists and writers. They were the ones who made beer and sold things at the markets, who spun and wove and built small businesses to support their families. They may not have openly gone against the status quo, but in their own quiet ways, they challenged it every single day. One such woman was Christine de Sand. Many people think that Christine was the first professional woman writer in Europe. She was born in Venice in 1364, and her clever father helped her to develop her ideas from a young age. Christine studied languages, classics, and science with her brothers. These were activities that girls and women weren't allowed to take part in at the time. When she was just 15, Christine's father arranged for her to marry a royal secretary at the French court. It was a good match and one that introduced Christine to a new world of politics, art, and academic discussion. For a while, the young bride was very happy in the royal court, going to parties and writing love songs that her clever friends admired. But Christine's perfect life would soon be turned upside down by a series of heartbreaking losses. First, her father and then her husband died when she was not expecting it. This left Christine a widow and a single mom when she was only 25. Christine and her children had no help from men. They did not know what would happen in the future. Other women might have given up in such difficult situations, but not Christine de Pizan. With her usual boldness and resolve, she picked up her pen and parchment and got to work. At a time when not many women could read or write, Christine started writing poems, essays, and stories very quickly. She produced a lot of work, and it was very original. But what made Christine really special was not just her writing talent, but also her courage to write about subjects that women were not allowed to write about. She wrote a lot about politics, war, and the role of women in society. She was very brave because she wrote about these things even though a lot of people at the time hated women. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, was a strong defense of women's intelligence and what they can do, and a sharp criticism of the many unfair things they had to put up with. In this book, Christine wrote about history from a female point of view and celebrated the achievements of great women throughout history. She imagined a perfect city where women were in charge and could do anything they wanted to do, like learn, create art, and be the best they could be. It was a new and revolutionary idea at the time, and it would have a big impact on feminist thinking for many years to come. Through her words, Christine de Pizan made a name for herself and earned a living. She also opened up new possibilities for women in the world of letters. She showed that a woman could be both a serious scholar and a commercially successful author. This paved the way for other gifted female writers to follow in her footsteps. Christine's amazing story was very unusual in medieval times. Most women were not able to get an education or do other smart things. Most people could not read or write. Even those who were often made to feel bad were told they weren't allowed to do it by the men in their lives. In medieval times, it was widely believed that women were mentally inferior to men. Scholars and religious leaders wrote lots of pages about how women's minds were not as good as men's. They said that women were too weak, too emotional, and too easily influenced by temptation to be trusted with serious intellectual matters. These beliefs had a very negative effect on the health and well-being of medieval women. Doctors often misdiagnosed and mistreated women's medical issues because they didn't understand female biology very well. People thought that menstruation was a curse and a sign of women being unclean. In the past, menopause was thought to be a form of madness. Childbirth, that experience that is most often thought of as being only for women, was a dangerous process that took many lives. There were no trained doctors or midwives, so women had to rely on folk remedies, superstition, and the wisdom of other women to help them through their most vulnerable moments. They made herbal drinks to help women give birth. People held onto amulets and charms, hoping they would help the baby be born safely. But often, these desperate measures weren't enough. Even for those women who did survive childbirth, death was always a possibility. There were a lot of diseases and people didn't have enough to eat. Fire was the only light in this world. A small cut could lead to a deadly infection. If a woman falls from a horse or down a flight of stairs, she could be left paralyzed or even die. And if a woman did live long enough to get old, she was likely to be poor and alone. In a society where there are no support systems in place to help people, the situation for an elderly woman was often very difficult. If she had no husband or children, she might have to beg for food or move in with relatives who didn't like her, and saw her as a burden. If she was lucky, she might find work as a servant or a carer and be able to make a bit of money in her final years. But often, she would be left on her own, abandoned and forgotten by a world that no longer needed her. The situation is certainly not good, but it's important that we don't forget the hard lives our foremothers had. Their struggles, sacrifices, and quiet acts of resilience paved the way for the freedoms and opportunities we enjoy today. We owe a lot to the people who came before us, even if we don't know their names. But even though we might like to think that we've left the injustices of the past behind us, the truth is that women's rights are still a work in progress. Even now, in the 21st century, women around the world still face discrimination, violence, and oppression every day. The details may have changed, but the attitudes and power structures that allow such abuses are not so different from those in medieval times. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. As we carry on the fight for true equality, we should remember the women who came before us. The Christines and the Ellalaners, the nameless mothers and daughters who survived unimaginable hardships and still found ways to keep going. We are all strong, brave, and determined because of them. We must honor their legacy and keep working hard until the day when every woman, everywhere, can live freely, fully, and without fear. So, let's not look at the lives of medieval women with pity or think we know better. Instead, let's show deep respect and admiration. Their world was very hard, with constant work and a lot of sadness. But even so, they still found a way to make happy, strong, and even rebellious moments. They were the unsung heroes of their time, the ones who held up half the sky, even as the weight of the world pressed down upon their shoulders. We owe them so much, but we can never fully repay them. But we can start by remembering their stories, by saying their names, and by continuing their fight. We will keep on working until there is no longer any injustice in the world and all women have the same basic rights and dignity as men. So let us be inspired by their example. We must always remember the sacrifices they made so that one day every woman can live in a world where she can be happy and successful. It's a dream worth fighting for, and one that we must never stop pursuing for the sake of our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, and all the generations of women yet to come. Life for women in the Middle Ages was hard. It was difficult for us to understand what it was like. From the moment they were born, girls had a harder time than boys in a world that was not fair to them. Childhood was a difficult time. Many children did not survive past the age of 5 because of diseases, not having enough to eat, and because doctors did not know much. Those who did make it often had to grow up far too fast. For noble girls like Isabeau of Bavaria, the change from being a child to being a grown-up could be especially sudden. When she was only 15, Isabella was sent away from her home in Bavaria to France to marry King Charles V, a man she had never met who was more than 10 years older than her. Imagine how scared she must have felt as she left her home to go to a strange country, knowing she had no idea what would happen to her. Isabel's marriage to Charles was arranged for political reasons, which was typical at the time. Love and whether two people are suited to each other were rarely considered when powerful families made these contracts. Instead, a woman's value was based on whether she could have children and if she could give birth to a son to continue the family's line of rulers. This put a lot of pressure on young brides like Isabeau. Things got even more complicated because Isabeau's new husband, Charles, wasn't mentally well. He often had periods of madness that could last for months. He was not able to rule his kingdom or be a supportive partner. This meant that Isabeau had to do most of the work. She was still very young when she became queen, and the role was very demanding. She had to manage the royal household, host important visitors, support the arts and charities, and do all of this while being pregnant or recovering from childbirth almost every year. Isabel did a great job of keeping the French monarchy together, even though her husband was often unwell and there were lots of noblemen who wanted to get power. She gave birth to Charles and his siblings, including the future Charles II. When her husband was unable to rule because he was having mental health problems, she took charge instead, which was usually a job for men. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, she was a skilled negotiator, signing treaties and even leading armies into battle while pregnant. Isabel's story shows how strong medieval women were and how they coped with huge problems. But it also shows that even the most privileged and powerful of women were still greatly limited by the traditional ideas about women and the institutions of the time. For most women who weren't born into nobility, their lives were very hard. They worked very hard for a long time, every day. Rich women like Isabeau had servants to do the cooking, cleaning, and childcare for them. Poor women like the other women had to do all of these jobs themselves. They also had to help their husbands with the farming and other difficult jobs. The lives of medieval peasant women were very hard. They had to do a lot of difficult work from sunrise to sunset. There was water to be fetched from the well, firewood to be gathered, animals to be fed, bread to be baked, and meals to be cooked in heavy iron pots over hot, smoky fires. People had to wash their clothes by hand in the river or in a local stream. Then they had to hang them up to dry. Candles and soap were made from animal fat. And of course, there was the constant spinning of wool into yarn. It's such a common task for women that the word spinster actually came to be used to describe a woman who is not married. Women from the peasant class had a lot of important jobs to do, so they didn't have much free time. Noble women, on the other hand, did not have to do as much of this basic work, but they also did not have any control over how they spent their time. When they weren't busy with their religious duties, noble women were expected to spend their days doing respectable activities like sewing, playing music, and looking after the servants. This left them with little time to pursue their own interests and goals outside of the home. No matter what class they were from, all medieval women had one thing in common. They were always under the control of men. Daughters were under the authority of their fathers, and wives were under that of their husbands. Women had few legal rights and protections of their own. Instead, they were seen as property to be passed from one man to another, their value tied to their dowry, their chastity, and their ability to bear children. Even in her own home, a woman had little independence. Husbands had the right to make all decisions in the household. They could control their wives' behavior and movements as they saw fit. They could do this by force if necessary. Domestic violence was common. Men were taught that it was their husbandly duty to chastise and discipline their wives, physically or otherwise, if they stepped out of line. The idea of marital rape was not around. A woman's body was her husband's to use however he wanted. If a woman dared to defy her husband or was seen to have damaged his reputation or honor, the consequences could be severe. On her wedding day, Marguerite of Flanders was abducted by her husband, Louis of Maille, who was furious with her for cheating on him. He locked her up in her own castle for 2 years. Louis was eventually released after the Pope threatened him with excommunication. But the scandal followed Marguerite for the rest of her life. This was a common problem for women in medieval times. They were in a difficult position. On the one hand, they were expected to be perfect role models, living a chaste and obedient life. Everything they did was closely watched to see if they did anything wrong that could make people think badly of them or their family. At the same time, women were seen as bad and weak because of the actions of Eve, who was the first to be tempted by Satan. This made things very difficult for women, and the church and society at large were very keen to control how they behaved. People were always expected to be modest and pure. Women were supposed to stay quiet and not show themselves, in case they made men feel tempted by their feminine charm. If a woman was seen to be sexy, or even just doing something fun with a man, like dancing or flirting, she could be seen as a woman who is ready to sleep with anyone. If someone was accused of being unchaste, they could be punished in a number of ways. They might be whipped in public. They might be dunked in water. They might be exiled from the community. In the worst cases, they might even be killed. Life was difficult for medieval women. Women felt alone, powerless, and trapped. They had to deal with difficult situations because of the unfair expectations placed on them. But even when things were really hard, medieval women found ways to live meaningful lives and make their world better. Take Christine Despin, for example. Christine was born in Venice in 1364. She was lucky because her father was a scholar and he encouraged her to be curious about learning. Christine was very clever and spoke many languages, which was unusual for a medieval woman. When her husband died, leaving her a widow at 25, Christine did something really special for the time. She was the first woman in Europe to make a living from writing. She wrote poems, books, and other texts that criticized the way women were treated badly in society and said that men and women should be treated equally. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, Christine creates a city made up of women of virtue and achievement from throughout history. By celebrating women and their achievements at a time when they were often treated badly, Christine started the movement that we now call feminism. Her revolutionary ideas influenced thinkers for generations. Christine was not the only medieval woman to be different. Hildegard of Bingen was a German abbess, a female religious leader who lived in the 12th century. She was a very important figure in the study of theology, the branch of religion that deals with the study of God and religious beliefs. Medicine, the branch of science concerned with the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of diseases. Botany, the branch of science concerned with the study of plants. And music composition. Joan of Arc was a teenage peasant girl. She led the French army to unexpected victories in the 100 Years' War. She became a legendary heroine and a symbol of female power. These amazing women show how strong and capable so many other women were, whose names and stories have been forgotten. It's easy to get lost in the long list of problems medieval women had to deal with, and to forget about their strong spirit when facing difficulties. Yes, their hardships and circumstances were in many ways very difficult for us to understand. But we shouldn't forget that they are also human, determined, and brave. Life for the average medieval woman was very hard. She had to work very hard, and there were many rules that she had to follow. She could be hurt at any time, but they kept going. These women were very clever and strong. They found ways to make life better for themselves and their families. They also found happiness through their friends. Their legacy is often ignored and underestimated. In history books, the achievements of great men often take precedence. But learning about the daily struggles and triumphs of medieval women helps us understand what it was like to be human in the past. It makes us think about how we live now and how there are still problems with gender equality. It reminds us of how strong and resilient women are. They have always been the backbone and lifeblood of human society, even when they have not been fully recognized or treated equally. The difficult lives of medieval women can be summed up by Christine Despin's words in her book, The Book of the City of Ladies. No matter where I look, I see nothing but the cruelty of men towards women. But God knows that women and men are the same. They are human beings just as much as men are. Even though it happened centuries ago, Christine's words still feel very true to us. Women in medieval Europe may have had it hard, but the basic inequalities and attitudes that constrain them have echoed across continents and eras. The fight for true female empowerment and equality is one of the most important struggles in human history, and it is still happening today. But when we think about medieval women, We should remember their hard lives, the limits they faced, and how they never gave up. This can give us strength and inspiration. They remind us of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. As we have seen, women in medieval times faced huge challenges and oppression in nearly every part of their lives. From the moment they were born, girls were treated unfairly. They were seen as a burden on their families. Many died before they were born because they did not get good medical care, did not have enough to eat, and did not live in clean conditions. Those who lived past childhood had difficult lives ahead of them. Girls received very little education. It was mostly basic reading, writing, and religious teaching. It also included things like sewing, cooking, and how to run a home. Unlike their brothers, girls weren't taught more academic subjects or allowed to do the same jobs. Their life path was set and unchangeable. Even more restrictive were the early marriages that most girls were forced to get, usually when they were between 13 and 15 years old. These arranged marriages were made to create political alliances or business deals between powerful families, and the wishes of the young bride were often ignored. She was basically being traded from her father to her new husband, like a piece of property. One important example of this is the story of Isabella of Bavaria. When she was only 15, she was sent away from her home in Bavaria to marry King Charles V of France. He was a man she had never met and many years older than her. She had to leave her old life behind and get used to a new country and a husband who was often ill and out of control. As queen, Isabel was given a role full of responsibility. She was expected to calm her husband, who was often in a bad mood, and have children to make sure the royal family would continue. All of this happened to a teenage girl who felt lonely in a place that was unfamiliar to her. Because she was young and didn't have much power in her marriage, other nobles were able to trick her. While Isabeau's story is unique because it's set in a royal court, it also shows how medieval women had little control over their own marriages. In the past, a girl's father or brothers would arrange her marriage to improve their family's social standing and make useful connections. She did not need to agree to it, and it was not important to her. When a woman got married, she became subject to her husband's authority and was expected to obey him as lord and master. Her main jobs were to run the home and have as many children as possible, especially sons. If a woman didn't have a son, it was thought that it was her husband's fault, not hers. This could mean that he would leave her. Childbirth was very dangerous in the past, before modern medicine was available. A lot of women died while giving birth or soon after, often because of problems like bleeding or infection. Many babies died before they were born or in their first year of life because of diseases, accidents, and poor nutrition. Even queens were not safe from these dangers. Eleanor of Castile, wife of King Edward I of England, had 16 pregnancies during her marriage. She did have several sons, including the future King Edward II, but she also suffered many losses. Records show that at least 3 of her babies were either born dead or died shortly after they were born. Others survived as babies, only to die from the many diseases that spread in medieval times. Eleanina's health was damaged by the many pregnancies and deliveries. She developed a prolapsed uterus, a painful condition that troubled her in her later years. In the past, when contraception was limited and there was no anesthetic or antibiotics, most married women would get pregnant at some point. This was dangerous for their health. But it was their job to have children, to do what their husbands and society wanted, even though it was dangerous. This was just one of many ways in which a woman's needs and comfort were considered less important than a husband's desires and the family's reputation. Her very life could be considered expendable in the quest for heirs. This was the reality in a world where women were judged mainly on whether they could have children and had little say in what happened to their own bodies. as well as the problems of having many dangerous pregnancies. Normal day-to-day life for a medieval housewife was full of hard work and boring tasks. She was basically available 24/7. Responsibilities include cooking, cleaning, raising children, sewing and mending clothes, tending to kitchen gardens and livestock, and preserving food. Her life was one long, never-ending job, with only short breaks for rest or fun. She got up before sunrise to start the day by making the fires and getting the chores going. She rarely stopped working until the rest of her family went to bed. Don't think about your own needs. A woman's life was all about looking after her husband and children. Depending on her background, a housewife might have a maid or two to help her, but this meant more work as they had to be trained and supervised. Women with smaller bottoms could not enjoy this luxury. They had to carry their heavy loads by themselves. In a small, smoky kitchen, she worked over open fires and pots, hauling heavy pots of water and breathing in smoke. Washing clothes and linen was a difficult and time-consuming job. It involved vats of boiling water, lye soap, and a washing board to scrub out stains. There are no modern appliances like washing machines or vacuum cleaners, so you have to use your muscles. There was no indoor plumbing, so disposing of chamber pots and cleaning privies was another task, as was hauling water from the nearest well or stream for cooking, bathing, and household use. Forget running taps. She carried heavy buckets back and forth over and over again every day. Preparing meals was a constant cycle. This was before modern methods of food preservation and storage were invented. You don't need to use the microwave or open a can. Cooking from scratch took hours, and you had to plan ahead to make sure you had all the ingredients you needed. The woman of the house was responsible for slaughtering and butchering animals, plucking birds, smoking meat, and curing fish. Then there was the making and mending of clothes. In the past, before ready-to-wear or store-bought clothing existed, a housewife would make clothes for her whole family, including the braids. Spinning yarn, weaving fabric, cutting, and sewing. One piece of work could take weeks to complete. When clothes got worn out, she would fix them up with patches and stitches to make them last a bit longer. You could also look into childcare, growing your own food, or making herbal remedies to help people who are unwell. You could even make things like cheese, candles, or ale to make a bit more money. You start to understand what is going on. Managing a medieval household was very difficult and required a lot of energy, skill, and self-sacrifice. It didn't leave much space for anything else. Even women of noble rank, who had more servants, were still expected to take charge of these affairs and help with tasks like sewing. They might not have to do as hard a job as their husbands, but their lives were still much harder. He was able to go off and do business, politics, or warfare, but she was mostly stuck at home looking after the home front. Women in the Middle Ages were the poorest of all. They worked very hard and had little rest, help, or respect. They got up earlier and worked later than their husbands and always agreed with their husbands. A woman never stopped working. She didn't get much credit for making sure everyone else had clothes to wear, enough to eat, and was able to function. This is the last part of the script. Some religious women, like Julian of Norwich, chose to live alone and think deeply about religion. But other women did more to take part in medieval society. The growth of the mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, in the 13th century created new opportunities for women to serve God and their communities. These orders welcomed lay sisters known as tertiaries. These sisters took vows of chastity and service, but lived and worked in the secular world rather than cloistered away in convents. People who worked in the medical field looked after hospitals, taught children, and took care of people who were poor or sick. They were able to move around and choose their own friends more freely than enclosed nuns. One important tertiary was Saint Catherine of Siena, who was born in 1347 to a large Italian family. From a young age, Catherine was drawn to a very spiritual life where she would not eat and not enjoy herself. She joined the Dominican tertiaries against her parents' wishes when she was in her late teens. Catherine was unusual for a woman from her time because she learned to read and write. She started writing to church leaders, giving them advice and telling them off. She even told off the Pope for living in France rather than Rome. Think about how brave it would have been for a young woman who was not a religious leader to say anything bad about the Vicar of Christ. But surprisingly, the Pope listened. Catherine was a very religious and wise woman. Because of this, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI decided to move the papal seat back to Rome. This meant that the Avignon papacy had come to an end. St. Catherine was not only brave enough to stand up to the powerful, but also kind enough to comfort the poor during the plague outbreak in Siena. She looked after the sick and dying, treating their open sores without worrying about her own safety. She saw Jesus in every person who was suffering. Catherine and her fellow tertiaries did a lot of good, but they still lived and worked in a very male-dominated system that limited women's voices. Only the best people could get important jobs, and they always had to follow what their male bosses said. Most medieval women were not meant to become saints or have political power. They worked hard every day, dealing with the many challenges and rules that were placed on them because they were women. It's hard for us today to understand how women had so little control over their own lives and bodies. From birth until death, a woman belonged to the men in her life. First her father, then her husband, and maybe her son if she was widowed. She had little say in who she would marry, how many children she would have, or what work she would do. Education, property rights, and legal protection against abuse were all severely restricted. But to paint medieval women as just passive victims of oppression doesn't show their full humanity. In their own little worlds, they found ways to make sense of things and use their power. They made strong connections with female friends and relatives. They were proud of their children, their work, and how they showed strength in everyday life. A lady from the village is going out to pick herbs to make her sick child better. A wife who is being abused goes to a convent to hide. A nobleman's daughter tricked her father into getting married a little later than planned. We see the strength of medieval women that is not often talked about. She may not have had much say in the big events in history, politics, and religion that shaped her world, but in her daily life, she did what she needed to do to survive. She was lucky if she found some happy and meaningful moments. One small pleasure that was acceptable for women was storytelling. In the castles, women might tell each other romantic stories about brave knights and their lady loves while they worked on their embroidery. In the villages, women would spin and weave while sharing old legends and fairy tales that their mothers and grandmothers had told them. Stories were a way to entertain, educate, and imagine a better world. They didn't leave many written records, but they still shaped our culture through the stories they told and kept alive, even during the darkest times. In a way, when you and I learn about the past like this, we continue that tradition. We tell stories about people who are no longer alive, thinking about their struggles and their small wins. This helps us to understand more about what it's like to be human. As we finish our look at the lives of medieval women, I invite you to think about that for a moment. Picture all the women, from queens to peasants, from nuns to brewers, from teenagers married to grandfathers, to widows who have suffered so much. Picture them as real people. They have fears and flaws. They can be brave. They are not very different from you or me. I hope you will dream of them when you go to sleep. Imagine the ways in which they changed the world and made it possible for us to have the freedoms we have today. Remember them, and also work to make a better world where everyone, no matter what gender they are, can live freely and make their own life. Thank you for joining me on this trip through history. If you enjoyed it, I hope you like this video and subscribe for more in-depth looks at the fascinating, frustrating, and inspiring stories of our shared past. There are so many stories left to tell, and I can't wait to dream them with you. Sweet dreams.